Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Helen Devine, Miss Devine, acknowledges that she was so into exposing that this student, this male student who had a wife and children, had dishonestly covered up a fact, that she exposed it out of integrity. But then she confesses later on, but what I should have done is cared about him as a human being.
Yeah.
Him as a flesh and blood person with children, with a wife. And she acknowledges her own imbalance. I mean, and that's a powerful moment itself. And it implies, if she's an alter ego for Harriet Vane, that Harriet also has had imbalance by rejecting the life of the body and just thinking in an escapist way, just to be within the walls of Shrewsbury. There, you don't have to encounter any of the difficulties of life anymore.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. I'm here with Dr. Crystal Downing, an eminent scholar on Dorothy Sayers. She has written Writing Performances, The Stages of Dorothy L. Sayers, which won the Barbara Reynolds Award from the Dorothy Sayers Society, a very prestigious award by a friend of Dorothy Sayers, who was also a leading Sayers scholar in her time. Crystal has also written Subversive, Christ, Culture, and the Shocking Dorothy L. Sayers, which was a Publishers Weekly choice when it came out last November and was one of their books of the week. She's now working on a book called Subversive, Diving into the Works of Dorothy Sayers. Is that right? No.
No, but after rereading Gaudy Night, I feel like I could write a whole book just on Gaudy Night as the fulfillment of Sayers' life trajectory as well as her scholarship and fiction.
Okay.
So subversive is appropriate.
Okay. And I'm also here with our producer, the Reverend Master Aaron Hill. In Germany, they give all your titles together.
Oh, they do? Well, I do have 2 master's degrees, and nobody has taken them from me, so thankfully.
Yeah, there you go. Well, there you go.
A little hint towards the character in the novel.
Okay. And we're here to talk about Gaudy Night. At our year-end review last year in 2020, which we're already missing. That was a pretty good year in some ways. We had a year-end review in which we made a end-of-year appeal for funds for the Wade Center. We are self-funded, and our motto is "We'll podcast for food." And we also asked for suggestions for books that you would like us to discuss. And the 2 books that were by popular demand were C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, which we discussed in mid-January. And the other one was Dorothy Sayers' Gaudy Night. So we're going to discuss that today. And we hope that you listeners who asked for some help with these novels will really appreciate these episodes. So let me turn things over to Crystal to talk about Gaudy Night. Can you give us a bit of context, when it was published, where it came in the Peter Wimsey series, why it's considered perhaps her most literarily distinctive detective novel? Give us a bit of context for this.
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions to answer. Sayers essentially started writing her Lord Peter Wimsey detective novels because she needed money. She had tried teaching, that didn't work. She had worked for a publisher, but it was an internship that her father had to pay the publisher for.
Oh, geez.
She went to France for a year to help out at a school. And finally, she actually, in one of her letters, says, well, I hear there's a lot of money in detective fiction. Oh, she also tried her hand at screenwriting. That's what she was really interested in. And that is the subject of my next book, is Sayers in Cinema. But anyway, so she writes the first Peter Wimsey book, Whose Body. She couldn't get it published in Britain, so it came out in America in 1923, but then was picked up in England. And after about 4 Peter Wimsey books, she was getting sick and tired of Peter Wimsey. She actually says in her letters something about his insufferable breeziness, gets tiresome, and she decided, and in fact, we know she decided this because in 1937, she was asked to write an essay about the trajectory of her writing of detective fiction.
Mm.
And she said, I was so sick and tired of his tricks and attitudes that he had become a monstrous weariness to his maker. And so she decided to write a novel with, and here's the quotation because she's so witty. And that's one of the things that people often miss in Gaudy Night is the wittiness of it. So she said she wrote a novel with the infanticidal intention of doing away with Peter Wimsey. That is. So infanticidal.
Yeah.
He was the child of her imagination, and she wanted to marry him off and get rid of him.
You could also call that sleuthicide.
You could. You would. So in 1930 then, so the first Peter Wimsey was 1923. 1930, Sayers wrote two novels first, or published two novels. First, one called Documents of the Case, which doesn't even have Peter Wimsey in it.
Oh.
She just wanted to see what the reception would be to a novel that didn't include Peter Wimsey. And it's called Documents in the Case. It's fascinating. We could do a whole podcast on that one as well. But also in 1930, she introduces the character that she's going to marry Peter Wimsey off in a novel called Strong Poison. And basically, Peter Wimsey gets this woman who is accused of murdering her live-in lover, and he gets her off of death row by exposing the actual murderer, and in the process falls in love with her. And so what's fascinating about it is that when Sayers invented this character of Harriet Vane, she liked the character so much that she couldn't stand the idea of saddling her with this insufferably breezy Peter Wimsey. And she decided, and she explains this in her essay that she wrote in 1937, that she had to change Peter Wimsey to make him worthy enough to marry Harriet Vane.
Oh, because he's pretty debonair in this novel. He's not breezy. He's pretty thoughtful.
Oh my goodness, he has changed. So this novel came out in 1935. So 1930 is when she introduces Harriet Vane, and then slowly we see a deepening of Wimsey's character. And by the time of this novel, he's in his mid-40s. And so part of it can just be maturing. But also to make him a significant spouse for Harriet Vane. And we see that, and of course, then the whole novel ends with her finally, after 5 years, and he keeps proposing to her.
I was going to say, how many times has he proposed to her?
Funny.
Multiple
Well, he says he'll
times.
do it at least 3 times a year on April Fool's Day.
Yes.
Yeah, that was funny.
And he'll start proposing, and she'll just say no before he can even get it out.
Well, in a way, he bequeathed his superficiality on his nephew who appears in this novel.
yeah.
Good
He
point.
seems like a young Peter Wimsey, doesn't he?
Yeah.
She does kind of transfer that characteristic to him.
Right.
Well, and you know, in his defense, a little bit, Harriet does change herself in order to sort of.
Of course, that's
be
what
ready.
this novel is about.
Yeah,
yes.
so it's not just a one-sided, she fixes him up kind of a situation. She has to go through some self-discovery of her own.
Right. Oh, in fact, it wouldn't work if he just pretends to change into what she wants.
Yeah.
So that what makes their relationship significant, and it's Sayers trying to understand what a healthy marriage would look like, because she did not have a healthy marriage. And it's where both of them change, but part of their change is learning to value what the other person values. And that they discover that ultimately they share in common a commitment to the integrity of work. And this became just one of the most important things in Sayers' life, partly because she didn't have a strong marriage. She felt like the only thing that she didn't really mess up in her life was her work, her commitment to creating novels that had integrity.
Well, I liked his metaphor of marriage. He said he liked polyphonic music. And so let's have complementary melodies
Yes.
Yeah.
rather than straight harmony. Let's go ahead and be polyphonic. I thought that was an interesting image of marriage,
Yes.
that you each have your own strong melodic line, but the two of them blend.
Yeah,
beautifully.
together it actually makes a beautiful arrangement.
Right.
That otherwise the two things on themselves wouldn't actually be able
Yeah,
to
let's
accomplish.
make a beautiful fugue together.
I think he actually uses that word.
Well, and also the symbolism of the Petrarchan sonnet, so that Harriet Vane starts writing this sonnet. And the symbolism of that is significant because Petrarchan's sonnets were written by Petrarch, obviously.
Were they
in-
sonnets?
And a sonnet is defined as a 14-line poem that was invented by Petrarch, and it's divided into an octave and sestet. And we're talking in the 14th century.
Right.
Where,
an 8 line of interlocking rhymes and then 6 lines of interlocking
Right.
rhymes.
Right. And Shakespeare changed it. So the Petrarchan sonnet then became very popular in Shakespeare's England during the 16th century. And
Mhm.
Shakespeare turned it into 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet at the end. But the fact that she uses a sonnet, because the sonnet is famous for being a love poem. It's always about love.
Mhm.
But Petrarch wrote over 350 sonnets to this unattainable woman named Laura.
Oh.
So to have a Petrarchan sonnet, and Harriet Vane has been unattainable for Peter Wimsey.
Yeah.
And so Petrarch just idealizes Laura from afar, writing these sonnets to her. They never get together. But then Harriet starts writing a Petrarchan sonnet. She gets the 8-line octave out, and she just can't figure out the sestet. And then Peter Wimsey discovers it. He finishes the sonnet. So it's kind of like the polyphonic music.
right.
It's a polyphonic poem insofar as both voices have entered a classic poem, which usually refers to the unattainable ideal. I mean, it's a brilliant move on Sayers' part.
Well, we mentioned was before the podcast, it's the only novel, the romantic culmination of "Will you marry me?" Yes, of course, is in Latin.
Yes, but even that is symbolic because part of what Harriet is working through is she just is so drawn to the life of the mind, partly because she's messed up the life of the body.
The
Oh.
heart. They talk about the heart and the mind
Yeah.
several times.
Yeah.
now.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. How do you create this balance between head versus heart? And because of this live-in lover who then she is accused of murdering, and even before that accusation, she felt betrayed by him because he says, well, I don't believe in marriage. Why don't we just live together? And then once they live together for a while, he says, okay, let's get married. And she kind of felt like she was given a bait and switch.
Oh.
Like he had to test her out and see if she was good in bed
Like
first,
an
basically.
audition,
Oh, wow.
basically.
Yeah.
Wow.
And she felt so insulted by that because he developed all this philosophical rationalization why he didn't
Oh.
want marriage to happen.
And which novel is this discussed in?
Strong Poison, the first
Strong Poison,
one.
Oh,
the
gotcha.
one where he gets murdered.
Yeah, where he's murdered.
But you
And she's
were saying
accused of it.
earlier that there's a similar dynamic between Dorothy and John Cornos in terms of
Well, the love of Sayers' life, yes. She fell in love with a Russian Jew whose family had come to England, and he was actually published in Ezra Pound's famous anthology of poetry.
Oh, wow.
He was a brilliant man, and they spent a lot of time together, and he kind of said the same thing to Sayers. So, yes, there's autobiography. He said, well, I don't believe in marriage. If two people love each other, they should just have sex. And Sayers responded, and she wasn't sure about that. And he said, well, of course, we'll use birth control. But Sayers was always told that birth control is a sin.
Oh.
And so she just broke it off. And what really stabbed her in the heart is he left, went to America, fell in love with a detective fiction writer, and married her.
Oh, no.
So it became clear, it's almost like the lover in Strong Poison, that he says he doesn't believe in marriage, but what he really means is, I don't want to marry you.
Yeah.
Right.
That sentiment crops up a couple times in the novel where the women are like, I'm not sure if I trust men. Sometimes they say that they have the right motives, but they really don't. You know, they just have some other motive in mind or whatever. And so you can kind of see that, and the women articulate that through the novel. I guess maybe because it's happened to them.
Right. Oh, and I had female students who would say the same thing in the 21st century. But part of what I like about...
Will you still love me tomorrow? Remember that old pop song?
Yeah.
She's really wondering if she's being used or if this is a serious relationship.
Yeah.
I think that's a perennial issue for women.
And of course, women have much more to lose because of pregnancy.
Yeah.
You listeners out there, if you'd like to hear me singing more often, go ahead and let us know, and we'll include that in future episodes.
Well, we'll have love songs sung by David, and then we'll have the Christmas album sung by Crystal.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the proposal scene because...
Oh, right.
Placebo.
She says... He says placenta and she says placebo.
No. Okay. That issue is what got me off track about this. And you listeners out there, we're making it sound like she's obsessed with sex. You know, that's what but that's part of the issue because, of course, a Christian view of marriage is about reproduction, having children for many people. And so this was something that Harriet Vane is struggling with. Do you have to sacrifice your intellect to become, especially we're talking mid-1930s, sacrifice your intellect in order to become a wife and mother?
Yeah.
And both are attractive. So that culminating proposal, when Peter Wimsey says to her, placetne, and she says placet, those were the words that were spoken by professors at Oxford University to students as they were graduating. That is part of the Oxford University graduation ceremony.
Oh.
So that very interaction symbolizes that Peter is celebrating her as having both a BA and MA from Oxford University. He celebrates her intellect, that she doesn't have to sacrifice her intellect in order to marry him.
Gotcha.
And of course, that's just the culmination of Harriet slowly coming to that realization that Peter Wimsey values the integrity of her work.
Well, that's true of the novel in general. For a popular novel, Sayers is often compared to Agatha Christie, but it has a depth of psychology.
Yes.
Some people say that Sayers raised, Jacques Barzun, the critic, said that Sayers raised detective fiction to a literary form. It's somewhat similar to people saying that Lewis raised science fiction to a literary form.
Yes, good.
But it's full of fascinating literary allusions. One of the characters says to Harriet Vane, "Oh, your novels are all facts. There's no psychology." And that's rather ironic because this novel is full of psychology.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different women all across the continuum struggling with careers versus marriage. What does it mean to be a woman? The heart versus the mind. It's an amazing contrast. We just read That Hideous Strength last fall. And his female characters, Lewis's female characters, are pretty much Jane wants to be an intellectual, but she needs to learn to just stop having dreams and start having children.
Right.
And Fairy Hardcastle is this very sort of parody of the butch female who doesn't have any feminine traits.
Right.
And so one of the things that strikes you, they're both university novels, but the wealth of female characterization and the variety of points of view in this novel are really stunning compared to Lewis's attempt to portray female characters in That Hideous Strength.
Yeah. Sayers once said of Lewis that he got all his knowledge of women out of reading Milton, and this idea that Eve is just totally supposed to subordinate herself to Adam.
Well, she has some good witty takes on her female colleagues or the female dons at Shrewsbury College. I read a dictionary that said around Shrewsbury. They say it with a long O, but most other people say Shrewsbury.
Oh, yeah, that's how I was
So-
reading it in my head. It's Shrewsbury, though?
Well,
Right.
apparently, if you live in that area, but
Oh.
this is Shrewsbury College. So are we going to say Shrewsbury?
They probably say Shrewsbury.
But I liked the Don. It said she knew all the 7 deadly sins in literature, but she didn't recognize them when she saw them in real life. She has
yeah.
a lot of. I think when you read about the novel, it sounds more serious than when you read the novel.
Yeah.
It's got
Oh,
so many witty
very
phrases.
funny.
Well, she handles the very deep topics in a very witty way,
Right,
so that
right.
makes it easy
Yeah.
to digest them throughout the story.
Right.
And you can tell she knows academia. There's all this competition.
Yeah.
This other character, she and her husband go out and do archaeological digs together.
Yes.
Says they go to remote areas of the world looking for stones and bones.
yeah.
And the one says, we're trying to undermine the thesis of
Landis or something?
Yeah, Lambard or some
Yeah.
name like that. And it says, he's quite a perverse idiot, but you can't say that in print.
Yeah.
So,
She's
we
got
have
to
these-
tone down her
Yeah.
husband's rhetoric in his papers.
yeah, but she says, what we do is we have these calm but deadly analysis of his work, and then we add deprecating footnotes. Yeah, you can really tell she knows academia.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that whole discussion about that professor that's writing the manuscript and the different
Yeah, and
stages and the
prosody.
galleys and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
kind of like, boy, she's really throwing in like, hey, I know how to write books, and I'm very
Yeah.
familiar with this. She kind of
Right.
throws that specialized knowledge
In
into the
fact,
story.
She
Miss.
sounds like a female Tolkien. She seems
Yes,
to be working
that's
on the
what I
same.
was
Oh,
thinking.
sorry. Excuse me. I should have.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, she sounds like a female Tolkien.
You already said it.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, the constant necessity of rewriting, and then everybody, all Miss Lydgate's friends, are appalled when she gets the page proofs back, and then starts correcting the page
Uh-huh.
proofs,
Right.
which is exactly what Tolkien would do.
Right.
Which is very expensive.
Well, so the one thing that's at times pulled me out of the novel was, which maybe you could talk about this, is her use of slang in certain places, which is, slang just tends to, I mean, cowabunga was big in the 1990s, but nobody says that now. Or totally tubular or whatever. But so there are times where she has these kinds of slang phrases, and that kind of pulled me out a little bit, and I'd want to go Google it and be like, what is that talking about? And then there were other places where she would place some crucial point or plot point in the novel right behind this academic wall that required a knowledge of Latin or Petrarchan sonnets or something that kind of pulled me out of the story. Was that intentional? Why is that just a feature of her writing in these detective novels?
Well, here's my theory, and that's a really great question. Sayers, because the central issue is whether you can, as an intellectual woman, balance marriage and motherhood with a life of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
flesh and blood with intellect. So we get once again into this struggle between dualistic thinking.
Yeah.
And so Sayers herself talked about Gaudy Night as a novel in which form and content were mutually reinforcing. And of
Oh.
course, that is, in the field of literature, the greatest literature is when form and content interact. But notice form and content. It's not just form. Like Agatha Christie is great at just the formal,
Formulaic, right.
formulaic is
The
the perfect
mechanics
word.
and
The
structure of a
mechanics
detective
and
story.
setting up, and you can never predict who the murderer can be until you read several Agatha Christie, and it's always the person you expected. There's exceptions. So you figure out who it is because
Yeah.
they're the least likely person.
Some detective novels, they almost have a guideline that says the crime occurs on page 4.
Right.
First suspect
Yeah.
appears on page 25.
Exactly.
Normally there's 3 likely suspects, and then it turns out it's a very unlikely person.
Yeah.
But it does seem to be very formulaic.
Right. There was one 1950s television show I was reading about. Was it
Perry Mason.
Perry Mason? That the culprit was always the first person who appeared after the second commercial or something
right,
like
yeah,
that.
that's true.
I mean,
Yeah.
to reduce it to the most banal level. So anyway, to go back to Erin's question, if she is trying to reconcile dualistic thinking, trying to put a Petrarchan sonnet together, trying to create a polyphony of voices,
Mm-hmm.
notice that the very form supports that content in that there's a polyphony of voices in that you get modern cliches or current cliches of her day,
Yeah, slang.
but also Latin.
Yeah.
So you're getting the both and, always both and, especially for Sayers. And this novel was just a couple years before Sayers' transition into taking her Christianity much more seriously, where she started realizing that this whole both and issue was the fundamental doctrine of Christianity, the incarnation. But she's exploring it in human relationships in Gaudy Night.
Gotcha.
So can you be both outside the academy and inside it as well? And part of Harriet Vane's attraction when she goes back for the Gaudy, the reunion, is she called it this walled paradise. And it's almost like, okay, let me escape this horrible background where I, in many people's minds, was an ultimate sinner because I was living with a man without, we're talking 1935, living with a man without being married to him and and then tried for murder.
Say, let alone being accused of murdering him.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. And to escape the problems of the flesh by entering this walled paradise where it's just about scholarship. And she actually early in the novel says to have one substantive footnote would be better than all I went through before.
Yeah. She
And
sort
of
of longs for that experience of just like digging into the books and ignoring the real world.
Yes, and being a scholar. And I think that reflects something in Sayers as well, in that she wrote detective fiction to make money, like Harriet Vane. But Sayers was really attracted to the life of the mind. She got a first when she went to Oxford University. But see, here's part of the problem. When she graduated she didn't graduate. In 1915, she did all the work that all males did at Oxford University and got a first. So she surpassed most males. But because she was female, she didn't get a degree because it was considered inappropriate for women to get degrees, since they should be relegated to issues of the flesh. You do not reward the productions of their mind.
And there's a scene in Gaudy Night where the young woman is attracted to this guy and says, well, he might be interested in this other woman. No, she's too smart. Men are intimidated by smart women. And they say, well, you're coming up to get a first, which is an honors degree. And she says, I know how to disguise that. I'll come across as weak and vulnerable. So she's actually having to pretend to be less intelligent than she is so she doesn't intimidate this man in her life.
I did the exact same thing in high school. I mean, this is a problem still for women. And in the 21st century, I've talked to students who feel the same thing, that men
I'm glad you said high school. I thought you were going to say, I did the same thing with David.
I've been keeping up that charade for decades.
Well, part of the reason I was attracted to David is he was so brilliant that he wasn't intimidated by me.
And I proposed the same way. I said placenta, and you said placebo.
But in fact, in the 1990s, I applied for a position to teach at a Christian college. And one of the professors in the English department said to me, well, this is 1990s we're talking. Your recommendations from grad school were too good to be believed, and we wonder what you did to get them.
Oh, no.
So the work of my mind was totally relegated. And the implication was, of course, that I slept my way to good recommendations. And so I, in the 1990s, was relegated to the flesh.
Wow.
Without my mind being reinforced. So if I felt that in the 90s, as I was applying for jobs, what was Sayers experiencing?
Yeah. Well, she really she vilifies that in a couple places in the novel with the Nazis. She throws out the Nazi doctrine of
Kinderkirche Kuka.
Yeah, children, church, and kitchen.
Right.
That's women's place in the world is taking care of children, going to church, and cooking in the kitchen. And when you put that kind of a doctrine in the mouth of the Nazis, it's it raises the stakes. It's sort of makes it hard to go, oh yeah, I'm in favor of that. But I thought
Yeah.
that was an interesting context in the novel was because that was a big thing for the Nazis was that sort of they actually took their theology. This is just a little theology knowledge here. They actually took the theology in the Lutheran Church and set up these idea that there are these sort of four stations or states in which everything should work. And so here's how the legal and the state world works, and then here's how the family works, and here's how the church, and each of them had sort of their realms in society, and everything was in its place. And so that was a big thing that people were fighting against from a theology standpoint, but you also see that manifested in sort of German life in the 30s, is bringing order to society. A very disordered Germany in the 1920s gets really just clamped down hard with these very conservative sort of you go here, you go here, you go here, you go here, and this is where God wants you to be. And if you're outside of that, you're being disobedient to God.
And that is a quite legitimate comment to make since, as you mentioned, Aaron, she mentions the Nazis. She also has someone mention Hitler.
Yeah.
So even though it was 35, the British were becoming aware of this.
Yeah.
This guy who wants to make Germany great and the problems with how he was manipulating things. So,
well, they had this common comment from British tourists was the trains run on time. They're so efficient. And they were talking about how fascism, there was almost this attraction, as you say, to the governments that could bring you out of chaos of the Depression.
Yeah, definitely.
These people in this novel, they're right in the middle of the Depression, both in America and Britain. They're living pretty well, I would say. You could tell this is a class which isn't affected too much by the Depression.
Definitely. There's also the thing that stood out to me, which we've talked about before on the podcast, so I thought I'd mention it, is the emphasis on the one professor that's writing about eugenics.
yes,
right.
Right,
Yeah.
the selected was it the British Society for Matrimonial something?
Fitness,
Fitness or something like that. And this idea that they were going to sort of pick and choose who gets to breed with one another, and intelligent women would breed with men of their kind and that kind of a thing. And it was very interesting how, it's included, and she doesn't really try to engage with it. You know, she's clearly turned off by it, but it's not a thing that, like, writing in a book back then, it was still kind of a thing you could write in academia, and people wouldn't, try and tar and feather you.
In fact, eugenics was very, very popular among the intelligentsia until all of Hitler's extermination camps were exposed, and they suddenly realized Hitler was the embodiment of eugenic theory.
Yeah.
Or he practiced the embodiment of eugenics.
And she had both sides of this character that Harriet meets. It's one of it is sterilization of the unfit, and the other half is like having a Tinder for intelligent people. We want the smart people to, reproduce and multiply.
Yeah.
So in her mind, not getting married, that's fascinating, like I say, about the whole spectrum of opinions.
Yeah.
You have, when she first goes back for her Gaudy for more or less like homecoming, one woman who was brilliant had married a farmer, and now she's a kind of a worn-out farm wife. And Harriet feels that it's like seeing a thoroughbred who won the Derby being used as a plow horse. But then another woman is such an embittered feminist that when Harriet gets done talking to her, she looks in the mirror and she says, there was something in that woman's eye that she did not want to see in her own eye. So I love her panoply of opinions about a woman's role in society in the 30s.
And I want to insert here, too, why this is really important, what Sayers is exploring in this novel, that women's intellects be affirmed and valued. Because once Sayers rededicated her life to Christ, as an evangelical would put it, her abilities to be a good writer brought thousands of people to Christ. What if she had been and totally capitulated to her cultural suppression of her intellect?
Yeah.
Thousands of people would not have been led to Christ.
Yeah.
And that was, of course, through her radio plays about the life of Jesus.
Right, man.
But then also what I think is brilliant about this novel is that Sayers, she's so committed to overriding dualistic thinking that she doesn't resort to the simplistic feminist rhetoric that this one Dawn uses, where all of women's ills are because of men. So all that does is it just what post-structuralists call invert the binary.
Yeah.
So if you have men in dominance in culture who suppress women, well, if all you do is say, no, men are the real problem in culture, that just flips the thing and doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
It just perpetuates binary thinking, which is ultimately anti-Christian.
Yeah.
So what a brilliant choice of hers to show that the culprit who is anti-female intellect is a woman who is totally committed to the idea that women's roles are to be wives and mothers,
Now,
rather
to give away the
than
ending
men being the ones who are suppressors of women.
Yeah. Are we going to talk about the actual criminal and the crime?
We can, because great art, again, is about both form and content. Now, Agatha Christie, it would ruin the whole novel if you say who the murderer is, because the whole thing is just this mechanistic setup
leading up to that one
until
moment.
you find out who the murderer is.
Which is why you don't read those stories a second time.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas a really great novel, there is so much there in the interplay of form and content that you don't have to worry about spoiler alerts.
Yeah.
Every single time I read Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, I get something new out of it, and it's interesting that Sayers alludes to Jane Eyre.
Yeah, the Bronte sisters. She's trying. That's an interesting moment in the novel where she's trying to think of like, well, what does actually make a good, strong intellectual woman? Is it a strong father, or a mother, or the combination of the two? So she starts going through all these sort of people in her mind: Queen Victoria, the Brontes. I thought that was an interesting part in the story.
And one of the colleges she calls Bronte College, and she has Harriet refer to Rochester. So I mean, and that's another thing. This novel is just filled to overflowing. In fact, it can be daunting with literary allusions.
There's actually an online resource about annotations in Gaudy Night, but it's not nearly as complete as it should be.
I was going to say,
there's a lot more.
Maybe there should be an annotated version of this.
There should be an annotated.
Because I got to say, when I was reading through it, there were a couple of places where I'd be like, so what does he mean by this? She's engaged in settlement and the Ottawa Conference, and there was all these things. I was like, I got to go Google that. Oh, that's what that's talking about. Oh, okay.
Well, a lot of them slip by you. There's Bible verses. At one place, Peter says, "You don't owe me anything," and Harriet says, "Accept my life, accept my life, accept my life," which is a famous line from Hamlet. So I agree. This would, if you were going to annotate one Sayers novel, this would be the one that needs annotating.
The one thing that stood out to me that I haven't seen anybody sort of talk about online, and maybe I'm just reading into this, is there seems to be in between all the other things that are going on in the novel, there's this struggle between self-control and being at the whim and the mercy of other people, sort of these outside forces. And so there's even in small moments. So like when she goes back for the Gaudy, she immediately regrets seeing her friend. I think it was Mary. That was the girl that goes off to the farm in Wales or something, because she doesn't want to remember her as she is now. She wants to remember her as she was in the past, and so she wants to hang on to that nostalgia of Mary when they were in school, not Mary as she is now, because it's like she loses control of that memory. And now that's all she's going to remember is the sad version of her friend. And there seems to be that just kind of a theme, even the discussion where she talks about being able to drive to the Gaudy in her car as if it's this great moment. She's in control, as opposed to showing up on a train. And actually, when I listened to that, I thought, well, I kind of would like to show up on a train versus a car, because we're all kind of, driving a car isn't cool and interesting. I guess in the 30s, it was a really big deal. And she was a woman, and she had her own car. So to me, that was an interesting thing that kind of showed up throughout the novel, was sort of like these kind of moments. And she does that with Peter Wimsey in a couple places where he asks her out and she's, says no. And then he's like, well, are all your nights busy? And so then she's like, well, I can go out tonight, as if that's going to sort of like turn the tables on him. And so it's just this kind of back and forth of like being in control versus letting somebody else kind of dictate what happens in your life. That seemed to be a theme that was kind of going on throughout the story.
That's funny, because Dorothy Sayers and her husband, they had a motorcycle with a sidecar on it. and they would actually get in disagreements as to who got to drive the motorcycle and who had to sit in the sidecar.
Oh,
And she
Wow.
wanted the control
Of course.
over the motorcycle.
Yeah.
So I hadn't thought of that connection to the control of even driving to
Yeah.
the Gaudy. And I also like your comment, Erin, about she didn't want to think of contemporary realities. And so part of her attraction to going to the walled paradise of Shrewsbury College is escapist. She is
Yeah.
trying to escape her past. She's trying to go back to a time where she felt affirmed before she messed things up, which is how Sayers felt, when she messed
Oh.
things up by having an illegitimate baby that her parents
Mm.
never even learned of.
Yeah.
And so there is an attraction that Sayers felt to it, but she was aware that that attraction was escapist itself.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the novel brilliant, because she's undermining dualistic thinking. And, still today, people talk about the university can be an ivory tower
Mhm.
where people don't have to engage with the realities of everyday life and
Yeah.
just escape into their scholarship.
Yeah. You're not forced to write detective novels just to make ends meet.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But at the same time, Sayers later criticized detective fiction as itself escapist, because there's
Oh.
always a solution at the end.
Very true. Yeah.
And real life doesn't work like that. And she says people's attraction to detective fiction is an escapist attraction where justice reigns at the end.
She
Yeah.
says that she says in detective novels, characters behave so logically. You can say, Colonel Mustard was here and Miss Scarlet was here.
Yeah,
but
with the candlestick
right.
in the study.
It's all very logical. But when the perpetrator, X, takes out all the fuses and they're in the dark, everybody runs around and screams and talks to each other, and it's impossible for Harriet to recreate where people were when this happened. She said in real life, people aren't nearly as logical as they are in
yeah.
fiction.
Right.
This novel is famous because there's no murder.
Right.
There's an assault, an attempt on Dorothy's life. I love the fact that Peter gave her a dog collar to protect her from being choked from behind, and it worked. It turns out to be very useful.
Yeah.
Crystal, can you talk a little bit about the elaborate scene where he's picking out a chess set for her, and he haggles for 2 hours with this owner to make sure every single piece is authentic and has a good provenance. The chessboard itself is authentic. You said you thought that was symbolic or a synecdoche of the whole story. Could you explain why buying the chess pieces is so important?
Synecdoche, by the way, is one of my favorite words.
The part representing the whole.
Yeah, the title of my dissertation had the word synecdoche in it. Yes, a part that represents the whole. So the chess set. Now, what's interesting about your question, and this goes along with our earlier discussion of these constitutive metaphors of collaboration, of polyphony, of two people completing the sonnet.
Mm-hmm.
And Sayers actually writes about the chess set in her book on the theology of creativity.
Oh.
And this resulted from that transitional moment in her life when she was asked to write a play for Canterbury Cathedral, and that got her back into theological issues. And at the end of her play, she describes creativity as being Trinitarian. Just as the Trinity is relational, so is creativity. You start with an idea, and then you incarnate that idea by writing it down, and then it has power, like the power of the Spirit, who brings us into relationship with the Trinity. So she gave the example of the chess set as an idea she had for the psychological change in Harriet Vane, where she finally is able to accept a gift from Peter. She didn't want anything from him.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, she owed him her life.
Yeah.
And hence that famous, the importance of that line from Hamlet. Yeah. So she just was so overwhelmed with her gratitude. And you can't marry someone just because, I owe him so much.
Yeah.
I mean, that is quid pro quo. That's not genuine love. So she invented that merely as a gift. Now, why she chose a chess set, she actually says in Mind of the Maker, her book about creativity, that only after she had the idea for the chess set did she realize how it would tie into the detective plot. Because that's one of the things that the marauder at this mysterious person who keeps destroying things at Shrewsbury College, she comes and destroys this one gift that Peter had given Harriet, and she suddenly realizes what hurt her the most is that it was a gift from Peter, and she suddenly realizes, oh my goodness, I must be starting to have feelings for Peter. But what I found fascinating when I reread, and I hadn't remembered this when I reread the novel in preparation for this podcast, is Harriet doesn't even know how to play chess.
Oh, yeah. She tries to play with this other woman. And she's not good. Yeah.
Yeah. And there is that parallel because we have Harriet Deborah Vane. So it's Harriet D. Vane. And the person who plays chess with her is Helen D. Vine.
Yeah.
Right.
And Sayers is obviously setting up an echo with there, especially Helen Devine. Helen was Sayers' mother's name.
Oh.
And then Harriet's father, she was named Henry, which was Sayers' own father's name. But,
and the culprit confuses their initials.
Yes.
In
Right.
the first part of the novel.
Right.
That is another significant metaphor in the novel, is that when Harriet and Peter are both dressed in their academic robes, they look the same. I mean, their faces aren't the same, but none of our faces are the same.
Yeah.
But the academic gown signals that we both can be committed to the life of the mind. But then they're wearing academic gowns when they kiss, which is, of course, an act of the flesh. So she brings those two, the life of the mind represented by the gown, which is the same whether a male or female is wearing it, but then also gets the plot going because the criminal who's doing all this nefarious vandalism
writing
at the
poison
college,
pen notes.
yes, confuses Harriet Vane's academic gown, which is laying on a table, with Helen Devine's academic gown. So the confusion between gowns is key to the plot, but then key to the resolution of the love marriage story. I mean, it's brilliant what she's doing there. And that's how Harriet gets involved in the mystery, because one of the nasty notes, the perpetrator thought she was putting it in Helen Devine's gown.
Yeah.
In the I forget, it's the pocket or the sleeve.
The sleeve,
yeah. The sleeves are very pocket-esque.
Yes.
Yeah. Gowns are still that way. When I went
I was
to
going to say,
commencement, I used to keep a water bottle in the sleeve of my
I was going to say, when I graduated recently from Wheaton, and there were some women that had they had like a whole stash of things in both of their sleeves because they're really long, you know?
Yeah.
Do you think Divine, in a way, is an alter ego for Harriet? It's like if she'd gone into academia, because she's very concerned about the integrity of the work.
Yes.
She's the one who allows someone's career to be ruined because she catches that person in plagiarism.
Right.
Is she thinking, there's a famous Henry James story where this literary person keeps seeing this ghost in his house. And finally you realize that's his alter ego if he'd gone into business and been a normal, respectable American person rather than chosen a life of literature. Is there any way that Divine might be an alter ego for Harriet?
Yeah, I think that's a good theory.
How do they kind of contrast? I guess I didn't really think about that when I was reading the novel about them being, her being an alter ego.
Well, she doesn't marry. It's interesting in this novel, most of them are celibate and they assume they're virgins. In some ways, it's a very lost world in terms of, this is not a Christian college, obviously Oxford University, but they're not allowed to drink in their rooms. They can't have men in their rooms. They have proctors who go out at night and make sure everyone is not on the town when they shouldn't be. Even as we said, they're so shocked by the swearing. This novel is supposed to be about really nasty language and vulgar language.
Yes.
But it's G-rated compared to these teen comedies that you have on TV now.
I was going to say, there's a number of the Poison pen notes where she describes them in just these horrible terms, vulgar and awful.
Vulgar
and
expletive.
Yeah, and then when they're described later or they get mentioned or something, you're kind of like, well, I mean, that's not that bad.
Yeah, it's kind of tame compared to
Yeah.
what we're exposed to today.
Yeah.
And once again, it's just a matter of inverting the binary. So people go, oh, things were so repressed back then. And now everything goes. And
Yeah, that's
there's
true.
no balance. Now, interestingly, about this question of alter ego, it is Miss Divine, Helen Divine, who makes a statement about the need for a delicate balance.
Right.
Oh.
And Sayers repeats that phrase, delicate balance, in a lot of her letters, in her analysis of creativity, in her theology, the need for a delicate balance, which just says a refusal of binary thinking, of either or thinking. You've got to
choose
balance
between one or the other.
between the two. And that's what this novel is about.
Right.
Yeah.
And wasn't it Divine who gave her that counseling right at the end of the novel? She says, you're obviously in love with Peter. You've really got to make up your mind about whether you two. And she'd been kind of harsh, and she's very, has high standards of decorum, but she's rather cold.
Right.
And isn't she the one when the perpetrator goes into this tirade about women who take men's jobs and displace men? And Peter goes over and checks Divine's pulse, and it's because she has a heart problem, but it's perfectly steady. Being attacked like that and being accused of all these horrible things, it doesn't bother her because she has such high standards of professionalism.
Mm-hmm. And she knows she's operated according to integrity.
Right.
Yeah.
But she is the one who really moves Harriet toward,
Right.
you need to resolve this issue. You can't keep dragging it out for another 5 years.
But to reinforce the alter ego, she also admits a failing on her part because she caught this graduate student in an act of dishonesty in his master's thesis, where he disguises a fact which would have undermined his whole thesis. And he was so committed to his thesis that he refused to acknowledge evidence, which kind of reminds you of certain people today who have such a thesis.
You're committed to the conclusion that you ignore.
That
isn't
they
just
will do
academics who do this.
anything to maintain their thesis.
Yeah.
And so that type of lack of critical thinking, seeing only one side of an issue rather than the delicate balance, rather than the both and of incarnational thinking. And Helen Divine, Miss Divine, acknowledges that she was so into exposing, out of an act of integrity, that this student, this male student who had a wife and children, had dishonestly covered up a fact, that she exposed it out of integrity. But then she confesses later on, but what I should have done is cared about him as a human being.
Yeah.
Him as a flesh and blood person with children, with a wife. And she acknowledges her own imbalance. I mean, and that's a powerful moment itself. And it implies, if she's an alter ego for Harriet Vane, that Harriet also has had imbalance by rejecting the life of the body and just thinking in an escapist way, just to be within the walls of Shrewsbury. There, you don't have to encounter any of the difficulties of life anymore. And once again, Sayers is undermining that because there's all these horrible vandalistic acts within and perpetrated by a member of the extended community.
You say extended community. One thing that struck me about Gaudy Night this time after reading That Hideous Strength is how much the undergraduates are a part of the extended community. In That Hideous Strength, all the action is among the dons. And I don't know if you meet an undergraduate.
I don't know that you do. I don't think there's any discussion of students aside from them being practiced upon by the faculty in That Hideous Strength.
But, so it's interesting in this novel that she really gets in individual personalities, and Harriet gets involved with Pomfret, and he falls in love with her. And you can see why female readers would like Gaudy Night. She's already got this debonair nobleman in love with her,
know,
with all
I
this
know.
money to spare, take her all these great restaurants. And then she has this studly young undergraduate who falls in love with her.
I told Natalie the other day that it seems like all of those kinds of movies that are targeted to women these days, that's the standard plot, is like the woman is in a situation where she's being imposed upon by society, but here's two men that she has to choose between. And that's sort of the resolution of the story, is she chooses between, the good one or the bad one or whatever. But I was like,
that had been true of male-oriented
definitely.
literature for
It's
ages.
very
Like
true.
Right.
Choosing between
even
two
the
women. Yeah.
The hard-boiled crime
Detective fiction.
Raymond Chandler type
Well, every
fiction.
every Bogart movie, he's all
Yeah.
these different women falling
Exactly.
all over him.
And
Right.
the whole idea
James Bond
of
movies.
James
the
Bond,
femme fatale. James Bond,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
all these women are just falling over him. And so
And I like that plot device better. I think it's more fun that way.
but when a woman tries it,
Uh-huh.
because we just think in grooves of cliche.
I was going to say, it becomes cliched no matter who's it's
Oh, yeah.
cliched in a
Once
James
again-
Bond movie and in a Victorian romance movie.
Yeah. To invert the binary
Yeah.
is problematic. And one of the things that I really dislike about a lot of films, and I'm writing about Sayers in film right now, is films that show women who can fight and kick and stab and shoot a gun
Oh, yeah.
as good as any man, and she kickboxes her way against 7 male attackers.
Uh-huh.
But what essentially movies like that are saying is, oh, look at this example of a strong woman. The implication being is a woman is strong is if she acts like a male.
Yes.
That's not feminist.
Yeah.
That's just inverting the binary. That's still saying male values of violence
Yeah.
to get out of a situation should be primary.
Chesterton makes a really good point about that. I can't remember where he writes it, but he essentially says, if all that feminism is turning women into men, then we're not really going to be solving any of these problems. They're not going to solve any problems that they're critiquing. They're just going to take on the worst traits of men and lose what makes them unique and what they have to contribute that, as women as opposed to men. And so that's a very interesting point by Chesterton.
Yeah,
I
and
like all these
Sayers
superhero-
reproduces that idea, and she was very influenced by Chesterton. She doesn't cite Chesterton, but in her 1938 lecture, Are Women Human?, she makes that exact same point. Just to merely copy males, that's not an act of strength.
Well, I was going to say that in these superhero movies, the women can fight as well as men, but they always still are beautiful.
Oh, I know.
They're not masculinized in the sense that they lose their femininity.
So it's the worst
and their
of
feminine
both
charm. Yeah, it's very unrealistic.
worlds.
There's a lot of
In other
pressure
words,
on
their
contemporary
mascara
women.
never smears, but they've just fought off 10 attackers.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
I know.
Definitely.
It's really
And
bad.
then you wonder why people feel bad about themselves. Is, why can't I fight like Vin Diesel and still look like Wonder Woman,
Yeah, definitely.
I want to go back to the question about the chess set.
Okay.
Because before our podcast, Aaron and I were talking, and David and I were talking about this too, that one of the daunting elements about reading Gaudy Night is trying to keep all the characters straight.
Oh my gosh, the first part of the story, I'm like, I'm going to have to create a notebook and start writing down sketches of these women because I'm not going to be able to keep track of all of them.
Every time I've read it maybe 5 times now, and I still forget each time I go through and I have to take notes. And I go, that seems like a flaw to me. But then when I started thinking about the chess set, and Sayers is attracted to it not because she plays chess. It's not for the game of it, but for the beauty of it, for one thing. And also, it's this self-contained board where everybody has their role to play, but different chess pieces can only go a certain direction.
To follow certain rules.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a metaphor for the women at the Dons at Shrewsbury College. They each have a different scholarly interest, and they move their thoughts in a certain direction. And the point isn't to get to the psychology of the chess pieces. It's that you need them all together to make a significant complete image of what the game of chess is about. So what Sayers is doing is just, I think, and it just came to me in this last reading, is she's trying to, just like every chess set, I mean, it can look different, and the pieces in this set look like no other pieces. Some chess sets can be just thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And others can be little plastic pieces.
Yeah.
But her point is, and I think she's right, is every university has certain characteristic professors. And those of us who have taught know that there are the professors who are like Miss Hilliard, who is just such a snob, and she looks down on everyone as though people just don't live up to her intellectual precision. And then there is the professor who likes to become best buddies with the students. And she has a professor like that who kind of is hurt when one of the students doesn't come talk about her recent crisis with her. And then there's the scatterbrain professor who's brilliant but can't keep track of things and, loses the pages. And there are the professors who are, have an agenda, like the professor has the eugenics agenda, and all their scholarship is just promoting the agenda. And we've all run into professors like that, where every work of literature they read through a Marxist lens, and it's just all about Marxism. And other professors, everything they read through a feminist lens. And rather than allowing the text to speak to them, they impose an interpretive framework.
Yeah, they see their theory everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you just pick and choose. It's like people who read the Bible and proof text. They know what they want to believe in advance, so they go and pick and choose Bible verses to support what they want to believe, rather than allowing God to speak to them through Scripture.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
So I made this sudden recognition that the chessboard is this symbol of both escapism, because it is a game, but Harriet Vane actually puts it on a table in the senior common room where all the professors hang out.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, this is like the negotiations among, and sure enough, once all this vandalism starts, the professors start questioning each other, and they start jockeying almost like chess pieces.
Yeah.
So they want to put the chessboard under glass at one point?
Yeah, they move something from the science building into Harriet's room, and then the criminal breaks the chess pieces.
Yeah.
I think a good idea for a bad article would be, because they talk about this character moved diagonally across the quad, and this character went straight back to the other side of it.
You translate all the characters into the pieces. And
then Peter took 2 steps forward and 1 step to the side.
He's the knight.
Actually, but there are scholars who do
they
something
do that, yeah.
I'm sure.
simplistic.
Yeah. Oh, you mentioned about the community thing, David, and maybe this is we can wrap up. I think we could talk about this for another hour, but you mentioned about the community, and I thought that was an interesting point that Peter Wimsey makes at the end of the story, where he says, "Hey, there was this crucial point where if you hadn't stuck together as a community and trusted each other,
right.
then all of this would have sort of fallen apart, and the university would have been ruined." And so that aspect of community ends up being a crucial thing that saves them. But it is interesting in the first part of the story, you get that feeling of like sort of every woman for himself, which academia can feel very much that way, sort of every person for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was an interesting point that she brings in towards the end of the novel. And that from a detective story, to me, it was unique because I'm like, well, this isn't a Peter Wimsey story. He doesn't show up really until, partway through. He doesn't really show up to actually, solve the murder.
But he does great work once he does show up. He gets a lot accomplished.
But he says towards the end, well, I just really, put the final cherry on the top of this. It was all the work that Harriet did that
in fact, he read her
notes. He's got her. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's a community effort in a way
Yes,
for them
yes.
solving it, the community of, Peter and Harriet solving it, but then also the community being involved. And so I thought that was an interesting part of the story that I guess I didn't anticipate going into it. I know that's significant because we've talked about Dorothy Sayers in Community and things like that in the past. So
Right.
Yeah, that was a very good point. The whole point of the perpetrator is trying to bring on disgrace and dissension, and her acts get more and more violent and more flagrant. It goes from notes to hanging an effigy to smashing up the library and smashing up the chess pieces to finally assaulting Harriet. And she's trying to break down their community, and he compliments them all that you didn't allow her to do that. You stuck together as a group. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that fits perfectly. Our colleague, Dr. Cologne, Christine Cologne, has a good book about the importance of community throughout Sayers' career. And even Peter Wimsey needs Bunter and Parker and other members of the community, and Harriet, of course, to do his work. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
In fact, that was a book written as part of the Hansen Lectureship sponsored by the Wade Center.
Right.
And
we did a podcast on that with Christine talking about her book and
she did
Dorothy
a
Sayers in Community.
fantastic job.
That stood out to me. And I think to me it was significant because marriage is sort of described as the sort of smallest community of persons coming together. And you see that at the end with them saying placebo to each other and agreeing to get married. So.
Well, since that was the ending of the novel, maybe that should be the ending of our Placetne?
Place passive.
Well, thank you guys for joining.
I wasn't up to it.
Thank you guys for joining us for a very female-centric January with Till We Have Faces and Gaudy Night. It was good to read these books. So I know that coming up we're going to be doing a series on the Chronicle of Narnia stories.
Yes.
Right.
So if you guys have a copy of those, you might want to pull that out and start rereading the Chronicles of Narnia, and we'll dig into those books. I've been rereading Prince Caspian again, trying to get through it. I always get stopped at a certain point along the way, and then I have to come back and finish it. And I need to just read it all the way through one time. So I'm looking forward to talking about those stories.
Yeah,
Great.
that'll be fun.
Yeah, it will be fun. Thanks
See
for
y'all
joining us.
later, or hear you all, or you'll hear us.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.